It doesn't take a ton of protein to get a lot of the muscle building benefits. One of the things I've observed, especially in the fitness industry, it just looks cool for Instagram. I think you're wasting your money.
I'd like to start with something that's rather basic and yet can be pretty complex. And that's this issue of energy balance and energy utilization. What happens when we eat food and how is that actually converted into energy?
This is one of those things where, people use the term calories in, calories out. What is a calorie? So a calorie just refers to a unit of energy, is the potential chemical energy that is in the bonds of the macronutrients of food. By digesting, assimilating, and metabolizing those nutrients, we're able to create energy. And the end product of that mostly is ATP. So a lot of metabolism is simply creating ATP. Protein's a little bit different because protein gets converted to amino acids, which can be used for muscle protein synthesis. Then you have fatty acids, which are able to create energy through what's called beta oxidation. So that's kind of like at the cellular level of how this stuff works. But let's look at what actually makes up energy in versus energy out. The energy inside of the equation is more difficult to track than people think. Food labels can have up to a 20% error in them.
Really?
Oh yeah, there's what's called your energy, but then there's also metabolizable energy, right? So if you have food stuff with, say, a lot of insoluble fiber, typically insoluble fiber is not really digestible. And so you could have, quite a bit of carbohydrate, but if you can't extract the energy from it, the carbohydrate and even some of the protein is bound up in the plant structure, which makes it inaccessible to digestive enzymes, reduces the metabolizable energy in there. And there's some evidence that some people may actually be better at extracting energy out of fiber compared to other people. Now, one of the things people will say is, well, see, that's why you shouldn't worry about tracking calories because, if the food labels can be 20% off. Okay, I understand where you're coming from, but typically if it's off, it's going to be consistently off. And if you're consistent with how you track it, eventually you'll be able to know kind of what you're taking in. So now let's look at the energy outside of the equation, which is actually way more complicated. And so your energy out is a few different buckets. The first one and the biggest one is your resting metabolic rate, so your RMR. And that for most people is anywhere from 50 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure. Then you have something called the thermic effect of food, which is a relatively small percentage of your total daily energy expenditure. It's about 5 to 10%. That refers to the amount of energy it takes to extract the energy out of food. All sources of calories may have differential effects on energy expenditure and appetite. So if we look at something like fat, for example, if you eat 100 calories from fat, your net will be about 97 to 100.
So the process of breaking down that fat essentially subtracts some of the calories away because you used it in creating energy.
Correct.
By breaking those chemical bonds to create ATP.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Fat is actually the easiest thing to convert into energy. Then you have carbohydrate, which has a TEF of like 5 to 10%. So you eat 100 calories from carbohydrate. And obviously, like the fiber content makes a big difference. Protein is about a 20 to 30% TEF. So if you eat 100 calories from protein, you're only netting 70 to 80. People say, well, you can't eat too much protein. The carbons from protein, it's unlikely it's going to wind up in adipose tissue. But if you're eating a lot of protein overall as part of a lot of calories, it has to be oxidized and it can provide a calorie cushion for other things to be stored in fat. So that's the TEF bucket and the BMR bucket. Then we go to physical activity. And physical activity is essentially two parts. There's exercise, and then you have what's called NEAT, which is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Now, people get NEAT confused. I've heard people say, well, I'm going to go out for a walk to get my NEAT up. That's not NEAT. NEAT is not something you can consciously modify. So for example, when I'm talking, if I'm waving around my hands, if I'm tapping my feet, well now, if I'm consciously having to do this, you know how the brain works. Very hard to do, you don't really do two things at once.
Right.
You kind of switch quickly between tasks.
About non-exercise induced thermogenesis, NEAT. My understanding of the calorie burn from NEAT is actually pretty significant. We're not talking about 100 calories or 200 calories per day. We're talking about, in some cases, hundreds to maybe even close to 1,000 calories per day.
Yeah, so there was actually a really classic study. So I believe they had people overeat, and I think it was by like 1,000 calories a day, and I think for 6 weeks. And what was interesting is, of course, on average, people gained weight and gained fat mass. But some people gained more than expected. And there was one person in particular who only gained like just over half a kilo. And what they found is this individual, well, calories in, calories out doesn't work for me, just spontaneously increased their physical activity. Like he didn't purposely do it. It just happened. And what's very interesting about NEAT is that seems to be the most modifiable. They've observed a decrease in NEAT of almost 500 calories a day for a 10% reduction in body weight. Well, what I'll tell people is if you're worried about NEAT, one thing you can do, these watches, for example, people are like, oh, well, it told me I burned this many calories. They are not accurate for energy expenditure. Well, calories in, calories out doesn't work for me because I ate in a calorie deficit and I didn't lose weight. They went to an online calculator, put in their information, it spat out some calories to eat, and they ate that and didn't lose weight. What do you think is more likely, that you're defying the laws of conservation of energy, or that you might have not gotten the right number for you? Yeah. The next thing is a lot of people weigh very sporadically, and I'll tell people, like, if you're going to make an intentional weight loss a goal, weigh in first thing in the morning, right after you go to the bathroom, do it every day, and take the average of that for the week, and then compare that to the next week's average. And the reason I recommend doing that is if you're just kind of sporadically weighing in and you just weigh in one day where you've just, whatever reason, holding some more fluid, then you go, oh, see, this isn't working. When in reality, your average might be dropping.
My understanding is that if that particular form of exercise is a muscle building form of exercise, that at some point later, there might be an increase in muscle if you did everything right, and then you will burn more energy as a consequence of adding that tissue. Let's assume I burn 400 calories during that. But my understanding is that in the hours that follow, my basal metabolic rate will have increased. Is that true?
Yes, there does seem to be a small increase in metabolic rate. And no, it does not appear to be enough to actually make a difference. This is actually one of the things I changed my mind on. Was I used to be very much, well, I think, high intensity interval training is probably better because you get this post-exercise energy burn. But in the kind of meta-analyses and like more tightly controlled studies where they equate work between high intensity intervals and moderate or low intensity cardio, so equating work, they don't see differences in the loss of body fat. Okay, we're seeing this small increase in basal metabolic rate that should lead to increased loss of body fat. But again, remember, you're capturing a snapshot in time, but we don't see a difference in the loss of body fat. So what may be happening, you might have an increase and then you might actually have a decrease that tends to just kind of wash it out. But I will say about the calorie trackers is, so if I'm used to 1,000 calories, according to this, it's not accurate. But if I go in tomorrow and I do 1,300, may not be accurate. I don't know what the exact number is, but I can be relatively confident that it's more than the previous session. And then the other thing I was kind of circling around on was, if you're worried about NEAT, tracking your steps can be helpful because people's step counts can spontaneously decrease when they're on a fat loss diet. They don't even realize it. Again, it also could be like a placebo effect, right? The placebo effect can actually change your physiology. People don't realize this. There's research showing that a placebo, or the power of suggestion, is basically as powerful as some pharmaceuticals.
So glad you're bringing this up. I take creatine monohydrate and have for years, and it's great, and I believe it's great. So is there a compound effect of believing it's great and it actually being great?
Not in this study, but the thing to point out, people will misinterpret that as creatine doesn't work. And that's not what that says. What it says is your beliefs about what it does are probably just as powerful as what it does. I think the effects of exercise on weight loss are actually more due to what it does to appetite. So if you look at people who lose weight and keep it off for a number of years, kind of outliers because most people don't keep it off for years, over 70% of them engage in regular exercise. Of people who do not keep weight loss, maintain weight loss, less than 30% exercise regularly. So now that's just a correlation. That doesn't necessarily prove causation, but there are some pretty compelling studies showing that exercise increases your sensitivity to satiety signals. So the sedentary actually ate more food than the lightly active or moderately active, but from lightly active to heavily active, they almost perfectly compensated how many calories they should be eating.
And do you think this has to do with changes in the brain centers that respond to satiety signals from the periphery?
I think the effect is probably mostly at the brain level. The research out there is not very compelling for blood sugar driving appetite. Now, if you become hypoglycemic, yes, you'll get hungry, but it's a different kind of hunger than like your normal, like I feel kind of empty and my stomach's growling. Why do we have such a hard time with losing weight, but more so keeping it off? Because of obese people, 6 out of every 7 obese people will lose a significant amount of body weight in their life. So why do we still have an obesity problem? People think about, I'm going to do a diet and I'm going to lose this weight, and they do not give any thought to what happens afterwards. If you do a diet, but If you then just go back to all your old habits, you're going to go back to where you were, if not more. You can't create a new version of yourself while dragging your old habits and behaviors behind you. Because people say, well, I'm doing carnivore diet, or I'm doing this diet or that diet. Do you see yourself doing that for the rest of your life? If you're going to lose weight, you have to invoke some form of restriction. So pick the form of restriction that feels the least restrictive to you as an individual, and also do not assume that it will feel the same for everybody else, because I made this mistake.
Is there any downside to a dabbler, keto for months and then omnivore for a few months?
I think that's actually a great thing, especially to maybe find what you feel is easiest for you. As long as they're still their behaviors and they're doing portion control or whatever it is, and they're able to sustain a calorie deficit or, depending on whatever their goal is, I don't think there's really any downside to it. I do think the one thing to keep in mind is when you look at going between extremes, so low fat to low carb or vice versa, there can be in that transition period a little bit of weirdness, for lack of a better term. But just because your body has kind of upregulated these systems dealing mostly with fat and glucose production rather than glucose metabolism. So now if you start taking glucose or carbohydrate back in, for example, you give somebody an oral glucose tolerance test after they've been on keto, they'll do pretty terribly at it. But that doesn't last that long.
About how long?
A few weeks.
Could you briefly talk about how macronutrients, including protein, but also carbohydrates and fats, impact satiety? And from the standpoint of somebody who, for instance, would like to, quote unquote, lose a few pounds, right? Probably would be happy to gain a little bit of lean body mass.
Yeah, a lot of things to unpack there. Of the macronutrients, protein is definitely the biggest lever that you can pull. It doesn't take a ton of protein to get a lot of the muscle building benefits. I think the benefits really start to plateau out around 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. There's some evidence that maybe even up to 2.4 or 2.8 grams per kilo may give a little bit more benefit. I think it probably looks something like an asymptote in terms of a curve where as you put more into the system, you always get a little bit more, but it just gets to the point where it's so infinitesimally small benefit that it's, for all intensive purposes, no benefit.
Is there any reality to this idea that if you eat one meal per day or you're fasting and then you eat 200 grams of protein, that you can assimilate more because you were protein starved? Is that a real thing?
Most of the studies with protein are after a fast because to assess it with stable isotope, you have to be in a steady state. So we haven't observed that. It doesn't appear that fasting really kind of allows you to assimilate more protein after a fast. Protein doesn't really have a storage mechanism, right? People will say, well, lean tissue is a storage mechanism. That's like saying a house is a storage facility for wood. My suspicion is probably if you're getting high quality protein meals in a day, you're getting the vast majority of the benefits of protein. The most important thing is getting enough total. And then secondarily, trying to get at least 2 or 3 meals with high quality protein in.
Be focused on ingesting minimally non-processed and minimally processed foods, maybe even cooking our own food. So what do you think about just a general statement that we should try and eat foods that are low to no, minimally to not processed?
It's hard to actually get completely unprocessed food because almost everything goes through some form of processing.
Right. So I'm thinking anything that wouldn't survive long without refrigeration. Yeah, on a shelf, like an apple or a banana or something.
Yeah. So I would 100% agree with what you said, that if you were going to make a broad stroke, that trying to focus on minimally processed foods is very important. Processed food just gets people to spontaneously eat. So yes, I think minimizing the amount of processed food you consume can be important. Now, that being said, it depends on the individual and their goals. One of the things I've observed, especially in the fitness industry, is when people feel like they can't eat something, people who will try to, I'm never going to eat sugar again, or I'm going to try and limit sugar. They have actually shown now in studies, people who are purposely restricting a specific nutrient, they tend to crave more of that nutrient.
This, I think, is a perfect segue for something that first brought us together. I became very interested in artificial sweeteners because of the animal data pointing to the idea that they may disrupt the gut microbiome. And then disrupt the gut microbiome, as you pointed out, is a very broad statement. We don't really know the percentage of lactobacillus, lactobacillus, or whatever bacillus illus in there. I have changed my view on artificial sweeteners based on what you've taught me. So this is a case where I've completely changed my view, which is that Now I don't have any problem with them.
There is no situation where it is not a net positive to take somebody who drinks sugar-sweetened beverages and have them drink an artificially sweetened beverage. But so when you substitute NNS for the sugar-sweetened beverages, you see improvements in a lot of different things.
Artificial sweetener containing beverages are more beneficial.
We're better for adiposity. And then in the health markers, it was kind of a wash. Water and non-nutritive sweetener beverages performed similar, but they were better than sugar-sweetened beverages, obviously. But again, is it the most healthy thing they could do? And I think that's kind of like what tends to get asked. We don't know. There are a few studies on the microbiome in humans with artificial sweeteners. The first two that came out showed pretty much no effect. And then there was a 10-week study that came out that got a lot of press, and they showed, I think it was sucralose, they showed an effect change on the gut microbiome.
A number of people want to know, what is the healthiest way to approach a kind of rapid weight loss?
You might be surprised by what I'm going to say, which is the research data actually tends to suggest that people who are like obese, who lose a lot more weight early, are more likely to keep it off. The more adipose tissue you have, the more aggressively you can diet without negative consequences. As your body fat goes down, the percentage of weight loss from lean mass goes up. So it's normal to lose, for the average person to lose like 25 or 30% of the weight that they lose from lean mass, but that doesn't mean skeletal muscle tissue.
If people believe that a food is nutritious for them, then eating less of it registers as more satiating. Whereas if people view dieting as a deprivation system, dieting is hard and they crave all sorts of other things. Whereas they actually observe in their studies where people report reduced craving if they are told, for instance, a chicken breast and broccoli and some olive oil and rice is actually quite nourishing. It's actually really good for you.
If the plate is a similar color to the food, I think people eat more. Whereas if it's a bigger contrast, they eat less.
Raw versus cooked food. Obviously, if you burn a piece of meat to the point where it's pure charcoal, there is a small movement surrounding eating raw meats. That's not something I particularly enjoy.
It just looks cool for Instagram. When you cook foods, they actually tend to become, in terms of protein-containing foods, they tend to become more digestible, not less.
What about gastric emptying time?
Specifically, fiber tends to delay gastric emptying and slow it a bit, probably because it congeals a little bit. In the studies where they don't control calories, low GI tends to outperform high GI, but when they control calories, there's no difference. Low GI foods, just by their nature, tend to be higher in fiber. And so I think it just kind of comes back to the fiber issue. Touching on creatine, it is the most tested, safe, and effective sports supplement we have. There are thousands of studies on creatine monohydrate now. If you're using any other form of creatine, I think you're wasting your money. It is tried and true. It's been shown to saturate the muscle cells 100% with phosphocreatine, and that's what you want. Some people will ask me like, how does this person make progress? Because, their programming is, it's not evidence-based or this guy, how's he like, his exercises are dumb. And I'll say, yeah, but they train really hard for 20 years. The more into the weeds people tend to get, and again, this is just my own anecdote and observation, the more into the weeds they tend to get, the less hard I see them train. That if you're looking to build muscle and you're looking to improve your body composition, the main thing is just doing the work over time. Getting the confidence of doing something hard that there's a payoff at the end. I get asked a lot in my Q&As, how do I get more confident? And I'll tell people, you have to do. There's no hack. You can't read about it. You got to get in the arena. And